Erev Tov to those who joined us from Israel, and quite a number, and Boker Tov to those who have joined us from the West. Professor Rubinstein, if you could lower the camera slightly, just so that we see all your whole face.
Sure.
All right. So this is really a rare event, not only because the times are so unique, but because of our guest. I usually do not delve on introductions, but I think that that even though many probably have heard Professor Rubinstein, Justice Rubinstein, over the years, and certainly have read things about him, from him, I want to add just a couple of points. We have heard and read a lot about the war. One of our most recent webinars dealt with the Hague proceedings, and even the legal issues have been covered quite extensively. And yet, Professor Rubinstein is uniquely suited to provide us with a perspective that has not been discussed enough. And his rare combination of Jewish halachic scholarship with legal scholarship prompted me to invite him, and I'm glad that he accepted the invitation, to share with us some of the dilemmas, some of the conflicts, some of the controversies that involve the war, the October 7th war, the Gaza war, whatever, however you wish to call it, and be able to deal with it both from a legal perspective and from a Jewish moral halachic perspective. Professor Rubinstein's career, and I hope that you took the opportunity and read up about him, but Professor Rubinstein's career became very relevant to the topic at hand early on, following the Yom Kippur War, when he became Moshe Dayan's legal right hand, and quickly became instrumental in many of the negotiations, the peace negotiations with Egypt and many other international consultations and negotiations, and became the legal advisor of the Ministry of Defense, and then the legal advisor of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And following that, he became the Secretary of the Cabinet in the 80s. And I don't remember, I think he was Secretary of the Cabinet for both Yitzhak Shamir and Yitzhak Rabin. And it's a testament to his unique qualities. I just want to say that I hope at some future point, Professor Rubinstein will be willing to meet with us again to discuss not war, but rather the topic that is close to many of those who participate in these events, in these webinars, and namely issues of state and religion, the Jewish character of the State of Israel. And one of the things that's less known is that as Secretary of the Cabinet, Professor Rubinstein attempted to try and resolve the ever-continuing, ever-plaguing who is a Jew issue. And the unique thing, and at that point I became sort of more involved, not directly, but indirectly, in these efforts, which have very little to do with the topic at hand today. But I will say that the unique thing about Professor Rubinstein's efforts as Secretary of the Cabinet was that he guided the parties, and they were the top tier leaders of both the Reform and the Conservative and Orthodox mainstream in America. And I at least remember from the Reform side, it was Professor Fred Gottschalk, Alav Shalom, who was president of the Hebrew Union College. And I think Rabbi Joe Glazer, Alav Shalom, who was the executive of the CCAR. And the interesting thing is that unlike what happens today, nothing leaked from those deliberations. It didn't end up as a successful effort, but nothing leaked. And it proceeded for quite some time, as I understand it, in most amicable and productive attempts on the part of all participants. But then Professor Rubinstein was appointed Attorney General. And of course, as Attorney General, he had many occasions to deal with the sensitive issues that come up again in the current war. And when we spoke, he mentioned, and I assume he'll raise it with you as well. And of course, then became a justice in the Israeli Supreme Court, and subsequently Deputy Chief Justice until he retired. And one of the latest rulings that he was a party to, and not just a party to, but wrote the lead opinion, had to do with the obligation of the state to allow use of public mikvaot, public ritual baths, by the Reform and Conservative movements for the purpose of the element of ritual ablution, which is part of the conversion process. Fascinating case. Repeated attempts on his part to reach a compromise, but as I said, we are not going to discuss it today, but I'm just telling you that I hope Professor Rubinstein will agree to come back, because there is so much in the other area that is of interest to so many of us, of the Jewish character of the State of Israel. And now to the topic at hand. But before that, I want to thank our co-sponsors. I see that quite a number of the leaders of those co-sponsors are on the call. The American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, and I acknowledge Richard Foltin, the new executive of the association, and Steve Greenwald, our longtime friend and partner, and the RUACH Hiddush, Rabbis and Cantors for Religious Freedom and Equality in Israel. And I saw Rabbi Neil Gold, who is on the executive committee. I assume there are others, but just too many participants, and I can't see all the names. And JPLAN, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network. And of course, we are glad to host you all and to start our session regarding the legal and Jewish challenges that the war in Gaza poses to us. So the first question, Professor Rubinstein, is what is the category that you would assign to this war in terms of Jewish law and Jewish tradition? And to what extent is that assignment, that labeling, still relevant today, given that these laws have been developed and laid down at very different times? So what kind of a war is it in Jewish terms?
Well, thank you very much, Rabbi Regev, and for your introduction. You mentioned, rabbis in the old days used to say, before I speak, I say a few words. So the few words are that you mentioned the effort in the late 80s to try to reach an understanding on the conversion issues. And indeed, I remember fondly the participants on the forum side was Rabbi Walter Jacob, also, who was assigned by Rabbi Gottschalk, by Professor Gottschalk, to join. And we had Rabbi Shosh and Rabbi Shama Friedman on the,
Conservative.
excuse me?
Conservative.
On the conservative side, and we had Rabbi Lem and Rabbi Bernstein on the Orthodox side, and some others, and it was really a very optimistic effort, which unfortunately at the end didn't take off for various reasons. But I remember meeting, for instance, Rabbi Jacob. He's the grandson of Beno Yaakov, who is one of the major sources of Nechama Leibovich in her book, mainly on Genesis. He also published his grandfather's commentary on Exodus, and there's a nice story with which I'll finish this short introduction. Is Rabbi Beno Yaakov's Rabbi Beno Yaakov was not supporting Zionism at the end of the 19th century, and when Herzl came up with the Zionist movement, and he convened his congregation in Germany, and he said, we are not accepting this, we are Mosaic Germans, and so on. And I'm sure nobody in our congregation will join this new movement. And his wife got up and said, I'm joining, which for both being his wife and a woman at the time was a real kind of special event. And it's mentioned by her grandson and also by Sami Gronemann, a famous German Jew who wrote on the period as a very significant story. To our subject, first of all, this is one of the worst periods in the history of the state of Israel. No doubt about that. This shocking surprise on October 7 was beyond anybody's, at least people's expectations, but it did happen. In fact, in this war, our own family was affected twice. A relative of ours was murdered at her home in Kibbutz Be'eri on October 7, at the age of 88, Hannah Kritzman, and then a brother-in-law of my daughter, Major Yitzhar Hoffman, was killed in action, a war hero, a month ago. And of course, everybody knows people who were affected this way or the other. The idea that the strategic areas of Israel have been evacuated is unbelievable. And nevertheless, I want to say right in the start, I'm optimistic. First, we don't have any other choice, lo avdat tikvatenu, but also because it is a must that this war will end in a way that will launch a new era. That's my hope, at least. And coming to specifically to the question, we are not, in the privy to the Almighty's decisions, and why did it happen? Why all this suffering to us? Why all this suffering to others? And halachically, this war would definitely be defined as what's known in Hebrew as milchemet mitzvah, because we had no choice. Maimonides has three categories of war. One is milchemet mitzvah, a war which is a commandment, which is a must. Milchemet reshut, an optional war, which also exists, and milchemet chova, which is an obligatory war. But let's concentrate on milchemet mitzvah in Hilchot Melachim, which is the chapter in his major work, Yad HaChazaka or Mishneh Torah, defines milchemet mitzvah, a war which is a command. One of the categories is to help Ezrat Israel midei tzar sheba alehem, helping the Jewish people against an enemy which attacked them. And I don't think that having lived through October 7, one could argue with the definition of this war basically as milchemet mitzvah. Having said that, of course, every war has its rules, and to be specific, there is a list of rules which are defining milchemet mitzvah, and in fact, the harsh reaction against the enemy, and very harsh, is permitted. The Talmudic Encyclopedia here in Jerusalem, headed now by Rabbi Professor Abraham Steinberg, who is a well-known doctor, but also a very well-known scholar, they issued a specific volume that was sent to army commanders and military chaplains, Hamilchama Le'or HaHalacha, war in the light of the halacha, which is very enlightening, this volume. We don't have the time to go into all of it, but there are, you are entitled to risk yourself. In fact, you're obligated to risk yourself in the war. You don't have to rely on a miracle. You have to fight against the enemy. And you even don't need, in this particular case, most views at least, you don't need to consult the Sanhedrin or the High Court. But how and what are the details? This is like everything Jewish. There's a lot of debate. We are a nation of debate, of machloket, on everything. We mentioned the conversion before. We could mention any subject, and on this subject also there are all kinds of debates by the sages. And I don't think we have the time to go into all the debates, but we really have to focus on, as you mentioned, the fact that these laws, which some of which are very harsh, have been written and elaborated on in periods when we didn't have a Jewish state or a Jewish sovereignty. And because of that, much of the debate is theoretical. It didn't happen in practical circumstances, and of course, there's a need always to see how you interpret and how you fit the halachic requirements or to the existing circumstances the way we have them now. And when we were kind of talking a bit, Rabbi Regev mentioned that a rabbi in Jaffa in Israel, a Zionist rabbi, took the halachic requirements or abilities or permits to a great extent to argue that there are many tough things you could do against the enemy. And of course, this was right away attacked as something too harsh, too very harsh. But one should mention that rabbi by the name of Mali, I believe, underlined all the time that for the soldier, now the commitment is to the military orders, and that doesn't mean that you're there with the book that would tell you do this, that to a civilian population. The other way, and this point is worth underlining because the war does bring tough situations. And our enemy, and this is not new, it's now obvious and wide and well documented, but the enemy, the Hamas people, have been deliberately using civilian population as their base and their shelter. That means that unlike the classic quote-unquote war where two armies were fighting, here you fight with terrorists who, and this is not a new phenomenon, but it has been grossly used in this particular situation, that when they speak of thousands of people who have been killed on the Palestinian side, among them, the numbers that the authorities mention are that about a third were terrorists who were among the regular civilian population. So what do you do in this situation? International law would tell you proportionality, but they don't tell you what the proportionality is. How do you do it by numbers? If we lost so far I don't know, probably close to, combined close to 2,000 people or 1,800 or something like that. So how, and what another nation, the United States or Britain, do in this kind of a situation? Let's say if the US would have had an attack from Mexico or from wherever, Canada on a boundaries, God forbid. So the but interestingly enough, the halachic elaboration includes the environment. Besides the way to deal with people, it has regulations concerning the environment. But if we focus on the enemy, there would be a debate. How far can you go halachically with the civilian population in terms of when you are fighting to erase the enemy, which is a mortal enemy? So Rabbi Regev, and by the way, he himself, as you all probably know, is a lieutenant colonel in the Judge Advocate General. I don't know if he's still doing reserve service, but he had his share in applying military law. And I'm mentioning that also because the fact that the war is so bound to create situations which you don't like to create, like causing the death of civilians and so on. The Judge Advocate General, who is, by the way, the first one who is a woman, Major General Ifat Tomer Yerushalmi, just a week ago issued a manifest or an order called Fight and Fighting and Victory in Accordance with the Law. And I will just translate to you the last 4 lines. It's a 2-page document, which speaks to the soldiers and to the commanders. The IDF is in a very complex war. As much as the challenge that this war presents, so is the strength of its justness. The preservation of the values of the purity of arms and the purity of our camp, and the IDF being a law-abiding and professional and Israeli army, is a goal which is shared by all of us, commanders and enforcement elements, enforcement units together, and we shall continue doing performing this mission together. So the awareness of the problematic that the war would presents to us is it's obvious. I attended quite a number of funerals, and I visited quite a number of bereaved families throughout this war. And I remembered something which I quoted in a judgment which dealt with the unending issue of the draft of the yeshiva students of the Bachorei Yeshiva. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach of blessed memory, who was a well-known ultra-Orthodox rabbi in Jerusalem, but very humane, very humane and very understanding of human needs. He was asked by a yeshiva kid to let him take off for a couple of days to go to visit graves of tzaddikim, of the virtues in the Galilee, kivrei tzaddikim. And Rabbi Auerbach said, and his yeshiva was in Beit Vagan in Jerusalem, which is opposite Har Herzl, Mount Herzl, which is the major military cemetery. And he said to the kid, when I want to visit graves of tzaddikim, I just cross the road to Har Herzl and I visit graves of the soldiers. And that speaks for itself. And let me just conclude this on this question by mentioning again that many of the halachic minutia or specific rules were written in periods when we did not have the obligation to defend our people the way we are now involved with. And and I would also say, and maybe we'll come back to it, that and I only mention that the sages understood the possibility of what's known as a slippery slope, midron chalaklak, and there are quite a number of halachic concepts which are aimed at putting fences, putting limitations on activities that may slip down to something you wouldn't like. Maybe we should.
Let me zoom in on the specific challenge that you posed, namely the handling of the attitude toward the citizens in Gaza. You mentioned that about a third of the casualties in Gaza were actual terrorists that took refuge and operated from within civilian shelters and centers and population. So if I can sort of zoom in on this specific area and ask you to relate to both the Jewish law angle and the international law angle, namely. So Rabbi Mali, that you alluded to, stated in his class to his students that there is no question in his mind as to what the halacha is, what the halachic rule is. And he stated there are no uninvolved in Gaza, and he distinguished between Gaza and Judea and Samaria. There are no uninvolved, which is, I guess, a cleaner way of saying everybody is guilty. And not only everybody, but specifically both men and women, children and the elderly, everybody, according to him, is to be killed according to the halachic principle that governs the situation in Gaza. So one question is whether there is, to what extent do you feel that there is divergence in interpretation of the halakha, and what is your take on the question of whether it is permissible and even commended to put it roughly, to kill them all and spare no one in Gaza? So what is the other approach that you feel is appropriate and valid and legitimate? And you are right, and in our conversation we discussed it. He repeatedly said, whatever the halacha is, you, the soldiers, need to abide by the army commands. But he ended his message by saying, but if you have the opportunity, and there is some flexibility in interpretation between the army commands and that which I tell you is the halacha, then interpret it, if there is flexibility, interpret it to the right. So what is your view? And is there the ability to counter and reject his strong claim that this is the halachic view and none other is legitimate? And at the same time, what is the position of international law? Again, there is a large civilian population in Gaza. Does international law legitimize taking measures that cause the massive destruction, and you talked about the environmental results, but the massive killing of civilian population because the terrorists are hiding among them and using them as shelter?
Thank you. First, I would start any discussion of this very sensitive and sad subject by mentioning that the Torah tells us in military situations, in battle situations, והיה מחנך kadosh, that your camp should be sanctified, should be holy. That is, behave as a human being. והיה מחנך kadosh. It is so important to underline. And that means that you should specifically be all the time with the awareness that what you are doing is maybe and is a must from the point of view of defending the country, of self-defense, which is the concept in international law within which we are acting, and clear self-defense, and still abide by the rules, and that applies both to halakha and to international law and to domestic law. I don't think I would teach what Rabbi Mali said to his students. You find sources like that, but the question is what you do with them and how do you, and at least, I mean, it's good he underlined that you soldier are under the command of your superiors, but You know, some years ago, when I was still on the Supreme Court, we had a case known as Torat HaMelech. Torat HaMelech was a book by Torat HaMelech, the law of the king, a book by some rabbis who gave a description of the halachic situation that was in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank, on how you relate to civilian population. And I remember the question was whether they would be brought to criminal justice or not. And we finally decided that it with a majority, by the way, 2-1, Chief Justice Naor and myself versus our friend Justice Jubran. And I said in the beginning of my opinion, which was the majority opinion, this decision is given b'chiruk shinayim, that is, by my heart, I said, is for enforcement, and my brain, my mind is with the many doubts, although every drop of blood in me is against the ideas and the opinions of the authors. I said, we are dealing with a book which is dressed in a Jewish mantle, but truly is anti-Jewish, because it slanders Judaism. It radiates a bad spirit, and I continued in this, and then the analysis, both Jewish law and the Israeli domestic law on that subject. I want to underline that when I was Attorney General, we were acting militarily in Lebanon, and I was sitting in every cabinet meeting, and in every cabinet meeting virtually, or about every meeting, I would underline that we should take into consideration in our planning the operations, the existence of civilian population. And let me tell you a story. I was having a meeting for Sunday many years ago when I was Attorney General with generals and colonels from the army for a pre-scheduled meeting on some issues that had to be decided. And they began the meeting by saying, you should know, as you are repeating all these warnings, you should know that yesterday on Shabbat, we had an opportunity to kill, to do away with the whole Hamas leadership. And why didn't, because they were all meeting together yesterday afternoon. And why didn't we do it? Because it was in the 4th floor of a tall building in Gaza. And if we would do what we could do, we would also affect many civilians who live in that building in the lower floors and the upper floors, and we refrained from doing it. I'm mentioning that because that personifies the dilemma that exists all the time, and as I said, halachically, you can find many quotes, but you also find debates. And you should remember that we are in a sovereign Jewish state and not just in a theoretical debate. I do believe that our military acts as much as they can properly, and I gave you the example of this manifest by the military judge advocate general, but it applies everywhere. And I always remember Nathan Alterman. I'm sure many of you know his poetry. He was the poet of the early decades of the state of Israel and the pre-state decade. And he was a very Zionistic Jew, very committed to Zionism, to Israel, but also committed. So you could say, he was on the right. No, he was on the conscious. And there's a book by a former judge advocate general by the name of Finkelstein, who wrote on Alterman and the purity of Israeli arms. And Alterman in the 50s would criticize any diversion from the appropriate way to deal with either Arabs or any situation which is sensitive. Now, I mentioned on international law, I mentioned self-defense. We are entitled, and the international community, as long as it's fair, knows that we are entitled to self-defense and to military activities the way they are conducted in Gaza. We are obligated, we are not obligated to do the humanitarian aid. That is, we are not obligated to, let's say, to feed the population if we can't, but we are obligated not to hinder any efforts by others, other countries, other organizations, whatever, to help. And if we can help, we can. And I can say that as a judge, as a justice, in past cases, we specifically helped in pushing in while we were military acting, let's say in operations in the past, which came to the Supreme Court online almost, which is also very unusual. You know, in our country, you can petition to the Supreme Court against the government and its activities without going through the echelon of courts. That's the Bagatz framework. And we, each time when it came, and I said quite a number of cases like that, we, beyond our obligation international law, we did supply with fuel, with electricity, and so on for the civilian population. And while now this is not our obligation, our obligation is to do the best to help or not to hinder other activities. A word again on the slippery slope. There are quite a number of examples which show the attitude of the sages to situations which may develop the wrong way. And maybe the best proof is, and very few people remember that, if you take the tractate of Sanhedrin or Maimonides and so on, you have a description of 4 capital punishment modes and detailed descriptions and so on. Practically, the Mishnah, an early text, says a Sanhedrin that would kill a person, that is, the high court that would kill a person once in 7 years, and some say once in 70 years, would be described as how should I translate it, Sanhedrin Chovlanit, a violent or something like that, violent Sanhedrin, but which means, yes, we have all these rules, but we didn't use them for procedural, evidential, all kinds of reasons. At the end of the day, the bottom line is that. And there's in the Torah, a son who is abusive and cruel to his parents is supposed to be, there's a capital punishment against it, could be executed. And what do the sages say? Ben sorer umore, that abusive son, lo haya velo nivra. It never ever existed, which means you have and then when you have ayin tachat ayin, an eye for an eye, and the sages, which is, it sounds very, very tough. No, the sages say, ayin tachat ayin is money. You pay compensation for damages that you inflicted on somebody. I'm bringing these examples just to try to show that the sages, or Ir Hanidachat means a town, a Jewish town that has worshipped the idols and has grossly violated Jewish law. And again, if you read the text, burn it and so on. And the sages say it never existed. This is just to show you what the possibilities, theoretical possibilities, so that you can discuss all these things. I'm mentioning that because you don't take literally the text. You take the text with the interpretations, with the warning against slippery slope. And I should also underline, Israel respects international law. International law is taken into consideration in all our legal debates. Not every country sees it in the same spirit. I remember the meeting with Justice Antonin Scalia of blessed memory from the US Supreme Court. He was a conservative judge and justice, and we met quite a number of times. And we were sitting at his office, and I said, look, you always refrain, you as a conservative, from being inspired by comparative law, international law. We are inspired by them when they are obligating us, and we are not obligating us, but we can learn something from that. You don't have to adopt everything, but you can derive wisdom from comparative or international and so on. His response was very typical. He said, I have one book. This is the United States Constitution. Whatever is in that book or from it is my law. I don't have any other sources. That was basically what he said. and I have great respect and great affinity for him, but I'm mentioning that because we do see international law as tell you an example, give you an example. In the early 2000s, we had what's known as the suicide bombers phenomenon, which was just terrible. For a couple of years, you had bus stations, buses, wedding halls, coffee shops being destroyed by bombers, killing a lot of people. The worst case was a Seder night, Passover night, in a hotel in Netanya Park, which triggered an operation by our military. And that was really an unbelievably terrible period. Nevertheless, in this operation, which was known as Chomat Magen, the defense of the wall of defense, we refrained from using the Air Force in Jenin, which was the hub, the basis of the terrorists, and we used our own infantry instead, which cost us many, I think 42 at the time, casualties, which could be avoided, but with the cost of casualties to the other side, which would be beyond what would be our choice as far as civilians were concerned. And then after that period, we erected the security fence. I used to call the Minister of Defense at the time Minister of the Fence, because we were dealing with the fence all the time. And there were arguments, including in The Hague and so on, against the legality of the fence. And our court, headed by Chief Justice Barak at the time, came up with a decision, because there were petitions. As you know, petitions can be submitted by Israelis, by organizations, by Palestinians. The doors are open in this respect beyond the requirements of international law. And and the court dealt with the legality of the fence. And it was the arguments against the legality included, inter alia, the difficulties to Palestinian farmers that now with the fence, instead of 10 minutes driving to their fields, would have to drive for 45 minutes or 50 minutes or whatever. And what did the court say by a decision called Beit Zurich by Chief Justice Barak? Was a decision very well known to Rabbi Regev, of course. He said, one, the legality of the fence is fine. It is legal because the state has the obligation to defend whoever is in Israel, and the suicide bombers have to be defended against. But second point, the difficulties to Palestinian farmers that could be solved by either diverting the fence in some sectors. And the court went throughout and I, even as a justice, I sat on it, I began as Attorney General, every sector, and whether it should remain or should be moved somewhat to ease, or a gate would be open, which is costly, but nevertheless, human rights have a cost. And ever since, so for to ease the difficulties of the Palestinian farmers. And the end was that this became quiet. All the fury was faded away, and now you hardly hear about it because solutions were achieved. All I'm trying to say is that we deal with bad enemy. We deal with an enemy which performed Nazi-like atrocities, like killing my relative in Be'eri, or many others, and kids who were in a party to dance and sing, and here they are killed in hundreds. But both, if you look at it from Jewish law perspective, a Jewish law which is operative in a Jewish state, and if you look at it from the Israeli domestic law, and if you look at it from international law, I think our military does a decent job in this difficult mission.
We are nearing probably the closing time, but I want to do justice to a couple of participants who raised questions in the chat. So I'll just mention the questions to you, and you'll decide whether you can briefly address them. Benjamin Usha is saying, "Thank you, Professor Rubinstein, for this unique and informative take on the war. To what extent do narratives of war in the Tanakh, such as Amalek, Joshua's conquests, etc., shape contemporary military halakha? Or are the narratives completely separate from the halakha?" So the question is, are the Israelis who are basically driven by the biblical accounts, and is halacha totally separate from that, or is halacha underlying those accounts? And Eva Kleinman is asking, "Thank you, Justice Rubinstein, for this informative presentation. You mentioned earlier that the halacha obligates Jews to risk themselves in a milchemet mitzvah. How does that relate to the refusal of the ultra-Orthodox to be drafted?"
Well, thank you very much. Before that, one word on something which we discussed, the two of us, before, and we now have hundreds of Hamas terrorists, those from the first day, the murderers of October 7, and those who were captured throughout the war in the last 5 months. And there's a challenge which is quite serious, how to deal with them. And of course, there is a law known as the law of illegal combatants, which enables you to keep them, to detain them. But do you bring them to justice as those where you have evidence, murderers, rapists? Do you have evidence? And what court would you bring them? Would it be a military court or a civilian court? For instance, when I was Attorney General, I decided that at least the big shots of the terrorists, which we had at the time, like Barghouti, if you know the name, or others, would be brought to civilian courts, not because we don't trust military courts. I myself was a reserve judge in a military court many years ago, but because you want also the look, the perception that it's a regular court. And indeed, this Barghouti was was by the district court in Tel Aviv, was sentenced to, I think, 5 life sentences plus 40 years, something like that. So, and then of course, so there's a question of the forum and the question of defense, because you have, if you bring somebody to justice, you need to give them the opportunity to have lawyers, and Israeli lawyers would hardly want to defend if they are the Nukhba, the head unit of murderers that did this massacre of October 7, and in the Eichmann trial, as you may know, we enabled a German lawyer to defend him, and I don't know what the possibilities now are as far as other kinds of lawyers, not Israelis, but because there's almost I would say there's a feeling of I can't defend this kind of a person, but they do have to be defended as international, not by international law, but by Israeli standards. So we'll have to see. Now on the questions, on the first question, I'm sure there are people that emotionally are thinking of Amalek. We don't know who Amalek is today. And as Nechama Leibovich says, there's Amalek in every generation. They change their names. Those who are presenting the ultimate, the evil are Amalek. So the Nazis and so on. And people, I know that some people, I read that some people mention the Amalek narrative. That does not constitute a part of our legal behavior throughout the war. The Amalek is a concept of evil, but Amalek, you have to erase them from the world. We are not there to erase Palestinians from the world, and that is not our narrative. We have a complex situation, but this is not erasing Amalek, although we are close to Purim in 2 weeks, and I hope we shall have some joy somehow in this Purim also as every year, but this is not the way we are dealing with it. Uri, could you remind me of the second question? I didn't.
Second question was, since you explained how Milchemet Mitzvah obligates individuals to lend a hand and participate in the war of defense, how come the ultra-Orthodox refuse to do that?
That question. Thank you very much. Well, I don't know what to say, because I had the opportunity to write in a few cases in the court on this subject, and maybe I can read to you something which I wrote in the newspaper. I have a column in Yediot Achronot every couple of weeks. I'll read to you a paragraph which I wrote a week ago, and I think that would be an answer where I come from. Quite a number of years ago, I'm translating, quite a number of years ago, I wrote in a decision, I'm quoting, there's no question that Torah learning is has a unique place in our midst as part of our identity and culture, besides being a religious obligation of the individual and the public in Israel. But, end of quote. But I said also, in the same vein, quoting, the huge moral failure in this respect in a state which did not yet achieve the quiet environment, and it is still far from the life of a person under their gafno v'tachat teinato, that is the biblical notion of being happy. In a subject, I'm continuing the quote, that should not have been part of political games, but or political debates, but part of the obligation to give a shoulder to the homeland when others do it, and that would not hinder at all the gates of Torah that will always be open, and there'll be a big effort to respect the Haredi way of life. I said, then end of quote, and I said, this could have been written today also. It was written many years ago. The responsibility is first and foremost on the Haredi leadership. There's no doubt on its commitment to Judaism and Torah, but it has also a commitment to the whole nation to understand that we are not like yesterday and the day before yesterday, and we should wake up in an area which is a potential for internal feuds. I'm sure that the IDF will do everything to not to hinder the Haredi way of life of those who will serve. And I don't forget the contribution of Haredi organizations, mainly in the identification of the bodies, God forbid. Wake up, leaders of the Haredim. This is not only the law, it is mainly the basic human moral, which is known by our sages as Noseh ba'ol im chavero, the obligation to help the other carrying the yoke. And mainly, and of course, in particular, the yoke of defense, which is so important, and that those who are the victims, our fallen, call you. That is a quotation from my column a week ago, and I think that would be my response to the second question.
Thank you, Professor Rubinstein. You've been very generous with your time and demonstrated once again your integrity and the depth of your moral campus. I think that we can draw. You may not describe yourself as adhering to Jewish pluralism, but I think that we can draw two conclusions, or a conclusion from two examples that came up in this session, both with regard to the last example you gave and the quotes from your op-ed, at a time when we know that the chief rabbi of Israel has announced publicly and was reaffirmed by the leaders of the ultra-Orthodox community, namely, don't dare draft us, and if you attempt to draft us, we'll all leave the country. So clearly, that is not your view, and your view is no less anchored in the richness of the Jewish tradition. And as you alluded to it, it isn't just the halachic formal interpretation, but it has to do with the understanding of what morality and responsibility and solidarity require of us. And this also takes us back to the beginning of the session, when you clearly dissociated yourself from the interpretation that Rabbi Mali chose to share with his students and the public, because it was widely publicized via YouTube, namely, however much Rabbi Mali and others who share his view would attempt to claim this is the position of halakha and none other is valid or legitimate, I think that listening to you, we should all recognize that the appropriate response is it ain't necessarily so. And we are grateful to you for sharing with us in a limited time frame, sharing with us the richness of Jewish interpretation that may help us strive to reconcile the core values of the State of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, and Jewish morality, and that of contemporary law and international law.
Just one word, if I may.
Sure.
First, while I'm Orthodox, I do have great respect for pluralistic Judaism, and that was you mentioned cases in which I dealt. I think that we ought to embrace all Jews, and not only in this particular time, of course in this particular time, but always as part of our national life. And while, as I said, I'm Orthodox, I see myself as a religious Zionist liberal. Religious Zionist, not in the sense of a party that we now have, but in the sense of the ideology on which I grew up and on which I educated Miriam and I educated our daughters, and now our grandchildren are being educated, and on values that are Jewish and universal, and it is part of our life. And I strongly disagree with the chief rabbi, with his statement last week. I just, frankly, I can't understand how he came to that. You know, he said that if we don't get the draft the way, or the non-draft the way we want, we can emigrate from Israel. That is something which I don't understand, and I, of course, disagree with. And I want to thank you for your patience, and all the best to you. And having said all of that, have a happy Purim in a couple of weeks.
So thank you for who you are and for what you teach and how you guided in your different roles the path of justice and humanity. And I hope we'll have a chance to sometime in the future meet with you again to discuss the less stressful issues of shaping Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. So toda rabba.
Shalom, shalom, everybody, and
Chag Purim Sameach, indeed, as you suggested. And please remember, April 9th, the innovation of rituals and liturgy as a result of the Gaza war. Thank you, and good night to us here in Israel, and have a great day to those of you in North America and elsewhere, and bring them home now is what our soul.
Amen, 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 amen.
Yes. We wish
Amen.
for our hostages to
Amen.
be
Here
with
it,
us.
amen.
Thank
Shalom.
you and shalom.